Muy bien, muy buenos días, bienvenidos al Museo Americano de la Diáspora Cubana, bienvenidos a su casa. Esta es la casa del exilio y aquí es donde se debaten las ideas que importan, y nada mejor que un día como hoy para este importantísimo foro, la estrategia de desinformación de Rusia, cómo el Kremlin fabrica la división. Así que inmediatamente le doy la bienvenida a mi querida amiga, la directora de ADN Cuba, Helen Martínez.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias a todos por venir y muchas gracias a los miembros de la prensa por estar con nosotros. Hoy estamos celebrando, realmente esto inicialmente es un evento virtual que estamos trabajando con distintas universidades en América Latina y aquí también en Estados Unidos, un trabajo de investigación que llevamos haciendo hace más de 1 año y medio sobre toda la propaganda, la estrategia para dividir nuestras sociedades, nuestras instituciones democráticas que ha trazado Rusia en nuestra región. Pero también hoy es casi imposible hablar de esta estrategia de Rusia sin considerar el eje, llamado eje de la resistencia, sin considerar el rol que juega Irán, que juegan los Houthis, otros grupos terroristas, Hezbollah y por supuesto China. Cada vez más estos países y estos grupos están actuando de una manera coordinada, amplificándose unos a otros a través de América Latina. Y no quiero extenderme mucho porque nuestros panelistas pues son además expertos en este tema que los iremos entrevistando, pero quería explicar un poco el marco en el que trabaja generalmente Rusia en nuestra región, y es esto que llamamos el control reflexivo, que es distorsionar nuestra realidad para controlar nuestras reacciones. ¿A qué nos referimos con esto? Ocurre un evento y la narrativa Rusia la va a enmarcar según las sensibilidades de esa población. O sea, por ejemplo, si estamos hablando de una población que tiene más sensibilidades hacia la izquierda, América Latina, la narrativa va a ser más hacia aquellas ideas progresistas, van a explotar mucho el tema del antiimperialismo, el anticolonialismo, porque Rusia ha hecho un poco eso, ha cooptado algunos de esos principios. Sin embargo, una cosa que hemos notado es que cuando la narrativa es en inglés es completamente distinta, porque entonces el objetivo aquí va a variar y el objetivo de Rusia en estos momentos aquí en Estados Unidos es penetrar mucho los movimientos conservadores. ¿Y cómo lo hacen? Bueno, la audiencia comienza a pensar sobre, no es únicamente una noticia falsa, sino premisas que se enmarcan de una manera polarizante, distorsionada, y ese es el objetivo, crear desconfianza y crear división. Creo que, no sé si Wenceslao o los chicos del museo pudieran mover el PowerPoint. Ok. Quiero poner rápidamente un ejemplo. En este trabajo hemos ido analizando narrativas por toda América Latina, lugares muy estratégicos para Rusia. Sabemos Cuba, sabemos Nicaragua, sabemos Venezuela, porque son aliados, porque amplifican constantemente su información. Pero también hay que pensar en México, en Argentina, son lugares muy importantes, y dependiendo de si el gobierno que está en turno es afable con Putin o no es afable con Putin, entonces vemos aumentar las narrativas o disminuir. Si vemos la manera en que Rusia, por ejemplo, aborda en inglés, en Russia Today, en Sputnik, el tema de las protestas de ICE. Esto es uno de los docenas de ejemplos que hemos logrado analizar. Y vamos a ver que el marco es Soros está detrás de todo esto, Trump dice que van a pagar por esto, amplifica mucho, por ejemplo, Steve Bannon, toda la narrativa es de law and order, ley y el orden, the big replacement, ¿no? Esta idea de que los inmigrantes vamos a reemplazar a los blancos. Sin embargo, cuando Rusia aborda este mismo tema en español, la narrativa cambia completamente. ¿Y qué hacen? Bueno, explotar entonces la victimización, aquel sentimiento de resistencia, ya la narrativa no es lo que dice, no es que Soros está detrás, sino es que los latinos están siendo abusados, que hablan entonces de derechos humanos. ¿Con esto qué queremos decir? Que Rusia no tiene hoy en día una ideología y no le importa la ideología, lo que le importa es determinar cuáles son aquellas narrativas, aquellos eventos que ellos pueden enmarcar de una manera u otra para, según nuestras ideas, según nuestras sensibilidades, crear y amplificar la polarización. O sea, es una polarización calculada. Y esto lo hemos visto, por ejemplo, en Europa, en Alemania. O sea, generalmente la manera en que lo abordan es de contraste. Creo que me gustaría que esto moviera. Ok. Aquí tenemos otros de los ejemplos que estaba poniendo, pero básicamente hay 5 tácticas que ellos utilizan para lograr este objetivo, que es la manipulación emocional, el miedo, la indignación, el tribalismo sobre el debate racional, una selección sesgada de las fuentes y de las noticias. Lo vemos mucho, por ejemplo, con expertos que utilizan de México, que trabajan para Russia Today, para Sputnik. O sea, ellos siempre van a tratar de utilizar personas que les sirvan para amplificar esa narrativa. La inyección, por supuesto, de conspiraciones, puede ser lo mismo Soros como puede ser completamente lo contrario, ¿verdad? Aquí ellos no es que ellos están de acuerdo con una cosa u otra, es que me sirve para dividir las faltas de equivalencias. O sea, esa es otra de las grandes falacias. Y básicamente son 3 objetivos: polarizar, generar desconfianza en nuestras instituciones y fragmentar nuestras sociedades. Hoy en día, con el auge del Internet, esto cada vez es más fácil, y creo que es muy importante para los periodistas y para cualquier ciudadano entender. Todos tenemos ideas y sensibilidades determinadas, pero entender que existe toda una maquinaria con mucho dinero que está encargada únicamente de tratar de explotar esas divisiones. Entonces quería abrir con esta breve explicación para darle paso a nuestros panelistas, y antes de comenzar el panel tenemos un video de Nicolás de Pedro. Él es un asesor del Parlamento Europeo en desinformación, una persona que ha investigado este tema durante mucho tiempo. Lamentablemente no pudo estar aquí ahora mismo, pero nos envió un análisis un poco como para enmarcar lo que vamos a estar conversando. Gracias.
Los mismos medios rusos, cuando difunden narrativas, y los mismos medios pueden difundir narrativas absolutamente antagónicas. ¿Cómo se explica que un medio pueda difundir 2 ideas antagónicas, ¿no?, y enfrentadas? Pues porque el objetivo no es informar, sino identificar qué desestabiliza. ¿Cuál es el objetivo final de todo esto? Subvertir y neutralizar desde el punto de vista estratégico a toda una serie de países que Rusia percibe como adversarios. El objetivo es estratégico, no es ideológico. Es una máquina gigantesca de desestabilización y de influencia hostil, ¿no? Para entender un poco cómo opera Rusia o su marco, ¿no?, yo creo que es interesante verlo desde 3 ópticas, ¿no? La primera, un poco la visión estratégica de Rusia, ¿no? Y qué es esta idea del poder incisivo, de las amenazas híbridas. En los años 90, con este clima de optimismo que reina en ese periodo, la idea es que Internet va a contribuir a esa agenda, va a contribuir al desarrollo económico, a la prosperidad, va a contribuir. La percepción es que la globalización va a ser un win-win, va a generar beneficios en todo el orbe, ¿no?, y que esto va a ser bueno, y además va a contribuir a la causa de la libertad y la democracia, porque se entiende que va a ser algo que nadie va a poder controlar y va a estar abierto, y esto es percibido por Rusia como una amenaza. Ellos conceptualizan esto como: esto es un ataque que me está viniendo hacia mí, y ahí es cuando empiezan a utilizar, ¿no?, esta idea de la guerra híbrida. Entonces eso es lo que explica por qué en los últimos 15 años ya aproximadamente pues hemos visto cada vez una Rusia y una China cada vez más agresivas, y lo que han hecho es cambiar la situación, en lo que en inglés se dice el weaponize, ¿no? Es decir, convertir en un arma, instrumentalizar de forma hostil todos esos espacios, ¿no?, todos esos vectores. Porque ¿qué han hecho Rusia y China hacia adentro? Lo que han ido es cerrando sus espacios cada vez más, ¿no? Digamos, el combustible que alimenta la convergencia estratégica entre Rusia y China. Por eso, aunque Rusia y China son países muy distintos, que han tenido rivalidades históricas, que siguen teniendo tensiones y desconfianza entre ellos, hay algo que es el combustible, ¿no?, y lo que hace que prevalezca por encima de cualquier otra consideración, que es la percepción rusa y china de que hay una oportunidad de poner fin de una vez por todas a la hegemonía de Occidente. La conceptualización es que la información es un arma, y como es un arma, hay que ser capaz de que el arma del enemigo, en este caso somos los occidentales, no nos haga daño, ¿no?, seamos capaces de neutralizarla, y además vamos a emplear ese arma para atacar a estos países desde dentro, ¿no? Y eso es en lo que estamos. La información como un arma y la idea de que vivimos en un marco de guerra informativa, de confrontación informativa permanente, en el que no hay ya una distinción clara entre guerra y paz, pero en el que, y que es, como digo, permanente. Quienes te perciben como un adversario o un enemigo, en este caso Rusia, está operando de forma hostil en todo nuestro espacio informativo. Y eso, pues obviamente, tiene unas connotaciones y genera unas consecuencias y unos efectos muy serios y potencialmente muy peligrosos. Y crecientemente, ¿no? Y digamos, el término o el concepto que se ha establecido, sobre todo aquí en Europa, es el de amenazas híbridas. Toda nuestra sociedad está construida sobre la idea de que sea abierta y todo eso convierte a cualquier dimensión, cualquier espacio, cualquier contexto en un posible vector de amenaza. En el caso de Rusia, esto en el fondo es herencia de lo que en época soviética se llamaban las medidas activas, ¿no? del KGB. Y que es muy importante entender que para el KGB las operaciones de información y la desinformación en Occidente, entendida como la semilla que planta el germen de la subversión, ¿no? con vistas a generar subversión, ¿no? A subvertir el orden político en Occidente, era el corazón del servicio, ¿no? Para ellos. Más importante incluso que la recolección de inteligencia. Lo que se ha ido recurriendo es a crear ecosistemas paralelos, ¿no? Bueno, yo no consigo infiltrar los grandes medios, o los grandes medios internacionales siguen marcando mucho la agenda, pues yo creo un ecosistema paralelo. ¿Cuál es el objetivo final de todo esto? Neutralizar, ¿no? Subvertir y neutralizar desde el punto de vista estratégico a toda una serie de países que Rusia percibe como adversarios. Y entonces ahí utilizan esto, modulan en función de los intereses, ¿no? Y esto se ve muy claro en algunos países, por ejemplo, de Latinoamérica. Es muy interesante porque en función de quién esté en el gobierno, la cobertura y la actividad se reduce al mínimo o se dispara de forma extraordinariamente hostil, ¿no? Esto, yo creo que hay dos casos que conozco un poquito, ¿no? Y que creo que ha sido muy, muy evidentes: Argentina y Chile, ¿no? Donde ahí la actividad, bueno, pues ha sido, como digo, muy, muy oscilante en función del el color de los gobiernos, que ha cambiado significativamente, ¿no? De un lado a otro en los últimos años, ¿no? Un punto muy, muy significativo, ¿no? Y muy revelador es que los mismos medios rusos, cuando difunden narrativas, los mismos medios pueden difundir narrativas absolutamente antagónicas. Ellos identifican cuál es mi target en cada contexto. Los rusos son muy buenos en identificar, en mapear, monitorizar todos los contextos y entender bien cuáles son los puntos de tensión, quiénes son los actores, ¿no? Cómo ejercer esa influencia, ¿no? Y cómo adaptarse en cada contexto, qué es lo que genera, qué contribuye a desestabilizar, qué contribuye a polarizar, con qué puedo generar más distensión, más enfrentamiento en esta sociedad, que este país, el gobierno de este país no está alineado con mis intereses y en consecuencia yo lo quiero desestabilizar. Esta es su percepción de los medios. Entonces esto es muy importante porque no son medios que están construidos o creados para que pues tengamos una mejor información, acceso a otros puntos de vista. No tiene esta motivación, sino que es una máquina gigantesca de desestabilización y de influencia hostil, ¿no? RT en español es un canal que está muy alineado con el eje cubano-bolivariano en América Latina, ¿no? Obviamente las narrativas que difunde, el punto de vista es muy a la izquierda, ¿no? Y cuando se trata, por ejemplo, de la cuestión de la inmigración hacia Europa, ¿no? De inmigración sobre todo africana, o de Oriente Medio y africana hacia Europa, ahí la narrativa es que Europa es una fortaleza insolidaria, insensible, que permite que la gente se ahogue en el Mediterráneo. Sin embargo, el mismo medio, RT, Rusia, o sea, el Kremlin, el gobierno ruso, cuando se dirige a audiencias en Alemania con el RT en alemán, la narrativa es radicalmente distinta. La narrativa es que la Unión Europea favorece la llegada masiva de inmigrantes con fin de reemplazarlos, ¿no? La teoría de reemplazarlos por la población europea e islamizar Europa. En Estados Unidos, claramente, en los últimos 10 años, ¿no? Rusia ha puesto el foco en tratar de infiltrar, penetrar, ¿no? En los ambientes conservadores, los ambientes del Partido Republicano, y hasta cierto punto han tenido, yo creo, éxito en una parte del Partido Republicano que percibe a Rusia, ¿no? Y compra esta idea de que Rusia es un aliado, que comparte nuestros valores, que es una especie de fortaleza para los valores cristianos, etc. Sin embargo, en América Latina, como digo, el eje es radicalmente distinto. O sea, Putin está diciendo esto mientras al mismo tiempo inaugura con todo bombo en platillo hace un par de años una estatua de Fidel Castro en el centro de Moscú con el dictador Díaz-Canel juntamente, ¿no? Los dos le ponen un ramo de flores a la estatua de Fidel Castro. Entonces, ¿por qué? Porque los objetivos, como digo, son esos. El objetivo es estratégico, no es ideológico. Esto también lo vemos, ¿no? Yo creo que es un caso todavía poco estudiado y que merece más atención, la enorme y creciente presencia de activos informativos y de inteligencia rusos en México, con vistas a que hay un elemento que obviamente es clave en el debate político estadounidense, ahora menos en la medida en que Estados Unidos está de nuevo, digamos, involucrado en una intervención militar en Oriente Medio, pero que sigue siendo un asunto, yo creo, muy central del debate político en Estados Unidos, que es la cuestión de la frontera sur, ¿no? De la frontera con México. Entonces esto, bueno, pues ahí te demuestra que el objetivo es precisamente desestabilizar, ¿no? y tener un instrumento con el que poder lograr, pues alimentar esta desestabilización y polarización en cada una de las democracias o países que no estén alineados con la agenda estratégica rusa.
Gracias. Vamos a abrir el panel y vamos a comenzar con algunos de los hallazgos que hemos realizado que va a exponer Jeffrey. Esto es un evento en inglés y en español, entonces algunos panelistas van a explicar en inglés, otros en español. Jeffrey Scott Shapiro fue fiscal, es un periodista investigativo, investigó durante mucho tiempo el asesinato de Litvinenko, ha seguido muy de cerca las noticias de la información de Rusia, investigaciones con Rusia, ha entrevistado muchísimas veces a diplomáticos rusos, le fue prohibida la entrada en Rusia hace unos años, está en una lista de Putin que no permite entrar a un grupo de personas, de investigadores, y además junto a David Satter, que es otro de nuestros colegas que ha realizado esta investigación, también periodista investigativo, han llevado a cabo este mapeo de desinformación en América Latina.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. The purpose of this virtual summit is so that we can make this panel discussion available to journalists and media. Oh.
Well, that's a lot better.
Okay. All right. To that end, the purpose of this virtual summit is that we wanted to be able to make this panel discussion available to journalists and media throughout Latin America so that they're aware of how the Kremlin is systematically targeting Spanish-speaking countries here in the Western Hemisphere with disinformation and propaganda. We also want to try to offer some explanations as to why Moscow is so interested in manipulating narratives in this area of the world and in general. Now, even though this is a virtual summit, we decided to hold this panel discussion. Not like that. I'll keep it here. That seems pretty good. We've decided to hold it here in South Florida at the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora so that we can engage with one another and hopefully field some questions from other journalists and researchers that are based here in the United States. That's why we've invited some of you to join us. This way the editors, reporters, and producers that are watching from newsrooms throughout Central and South America can hopefully get some of the questions they have arising in their minds as they're watching answered by some of you here in the media. Just to offer a little bit of background about how this project came about, I started covering Russia about 15 years ago with the Washington Times. My colleague David Satter here has been covering it for decades. He covered the Soviet Union on location in Moscow, which is something he'll hopefully tell us a little bit about. But during that time, while covering Russia, I had written one piece in particular for the Wall Street Journal that seemed to get the attention of the Russian Federation. This came after several pieces I had written for the Washington Times exposing the fallacies and the lies perpetuated by the Kremlin about their illegal invasion in Ukraine. And I had previously conducted interviews inside the Russian embassy in Washington. But when I wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal about how Russia was now targeting certain elements in the United States, I suddenly found myself banned by the Russian Federation in 2023. And I think that probably had a lot to do with the fact that I was actually starting to pinpoint some of their influence operations here in the Western Hemisphere. So they're very sensitive about that. And one of the reasons they're very sensitive about it is because they have a huge investment in it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So working with Mr. Satter and the Digital News Association, with Ms. Martinez Verhello, we started to use an artificial intelligence dashboard to monitor stories that were being published in Spanish language components of Russia's state-sponsored media apparatus. This includes RT Español, Sputnik Mundo, RIA Novosti, TASS News, and even the social media accounts of Russian embassies throughout Latin America, which is something we're going to talk about. They have used these social media accounts as a way to amplify their message through, quote, credible channels. We were very surprised to learn that RT en Español has about 200 Spanish language speaking content creators and journalists on location in Moscow. In terms of Latin America, we've learned that they have about 1,000 journalists and influencers that they've actually trained throughout the region. That came as quite a surprise to me. One of the reasons for that is I previously worked for the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the agency that oversees Voice of America and Radio and Television Marti, and I was surprised at the incredible investment that Russia was making in its disinformation efforts, not only here in the United States, but throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. So how do they do it?
Sorry.
And let me see if I can...
Let's see if we can get to the next slide there. Thank you. The Kremlin doesn't just broadcast propaganda there from Russia. What it does is it manufactures it there. Like I said, they're training people on site, okay? And we actually found that there were 8 countries in Latin America, which I'll get into, that have active... Can you go back for a second? Sorry. Right, active influence infrastructure. And in addition to those 1,000 people that they're training in Latin America, we actually found that they had 18 million followers of RT en Español. Now, I can tell you, as someone who's worked for the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the efforts that Russia has made in terms of its state-sponsored media apparatus is extraordinary, and they are outspending us by far. Now, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about how they actually do this. Just click to the next slide. Okay. So one of the first things they do is they engage in information laundering. This is also known as narrative laundering.
We can move to the podium because of the audio. Is that possible?
I'm not really sure.
Sorry. Yeah,
That's okay.
maybe we should.
You can't. You guys can't hear me?
Okay. No, we can.
You can. Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can.
Let me move it. Yeah.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Let me see if I can.
You can put it on the table.
I think I just muted it.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about how they accomplish this. Okay, so first they engage in information laundering. This is also known as narrative laundering or structural laundering. The Kremlin likes to use private firms like the Social Design Agency and Structura to localize Russian-created content. What they do is they pass it through local journalists and influencers to try to make it appear organic to regional audiences, okay? This, of course, is a very important strategic component on behalf of the Kremlin because they're trying to manipulate public opinion in international settings. And they want it to be trusted, so they go through local channels to promote a foreign narrative. Who are you going to trust more? Are you going to trust someone who's based in your country or a foreign country, okay? So they localize it. Second, they weaponize diplomacy, okay? Russian ambassadors serve as legitimized mouthpieces. They try to tailor narratives such as denazification of Ukraine while espousing anti-colonialism, okay? This is a big narrative that we notice that is heavily focused on Latin America, obviously a lot more than the United States. They're trying to trigger the historical memory of Latinos who remember certain events such as the 1954 CIA interference in Guatemala. They try to portray the United States as imperialist. A lot of the same messages that we saw come out of the USSR before the collapse of the Soviet Union, okay? Third, they also capitalize off of physical and military intelligence as well as paramilitary links. There are recent counterintelligence operations in Argentina, for instance, that have dismantled networks that were linked to the Wagner Group, uncovering efforts to collect political intelligence and disseminate information as a way to dominate the marketplace of ideas there, okay? So they're using all these different channels. they also try to engage in media dominance by using their own outlets, okay? They have state-sponsored media outlets. I'm sure you guys have heard of Sputnik and Russia Today, of course, the old Soviet press agency TASS. I mentioned Ria Novosti before. They have Spanish components of these. They have RT in Español. They have Sputnik Mundo. These sites are flourishing throughout Latin America, okay? They may seem a little bit obscure here. There's not a lot of people here who openly read Russian state media, at least knowingly, but in Latin America, these sites are flourishing very much. They are significantly outperforming their Western counterparts, like I said. They are leveraging workshops such as RT Comparte. They are training journalists in these regions, and they are integrating Russian narratives into indigenous platforms. Like I said, they're localizing it, okay? Fifth, Russia has strategic objectives, okay? The overarching goal for the Kremlin is reflexive control. The United Russia regime, that's Putin's regime, wants to alter the perception of reality. It's something that David Satter could probably talk about. He's written books about this. They want to alter reality for Latin American audiences. They want to weaken support for Ukraine, foster U.S. anti-sentiment throughout the region, and promote a Russian-led multipolar world. So anyone who thinks that today's Russia is any different than what it was before 1991 is incorrect. Today's Russia has some of the same objectives as Soviet Russia, and that is to dominate the West by breaking down its value system and turning America's allies against her and alienating its allies and potential allies from Washington. Okay.
Go to the next.
This is good. The cycle. Please go back. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about this cycle. Okay. First of all, the Kremlin does not rely on any one single vector for influence. Okay. It coordinates a vast network of actors that blend overt and covert operations. It engages in creation, localization, placement, and amplification. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. There's usually a team in Russia that generates content, and then it gets processed through a foreign pipeline to hide its origin, okay? So they develop these themes in content. Now, we saw some of this in the Mueller report, which focused on the Internet Research Agency out of St. Petersburg and how they had hundreds of people working there. They were manufacturing false information to disrupt and interfere in U.S. election operations. Well, we also have, like I said before, the Social Design Agency and structure of private firms that are developing themes and contents that are designed to undermine the United States and her allies. And then they go through a process of translation and editing. Remember, I talked to you before about those 200 content creators at RT and Español on location in Moscow, okay? So they also use aliases. They use Spanish bylines so people trust the content more. They think it's actually coming from someone of Hispanic origin, not someone of Russian origin. And then they place it somewhere in Latin America. Moscow relies on a highly cultivated editorial staff in Latin America. They actually have a significant number of people in Chile that review and publish the material it manufactures back in Moscow in local media. Then to maximize that impact, they push that material through all of its channels and they amplify it. They use networks and bots, so-called, quote, patriotic hackers, to intensify the contact to penetrate the broader information environment. Okay. Can we go to slide 4? Hold on, I think. Which one is that? Maybe go, hold on just a second. Back a little
This
bit.
one? We already did also.
Hold on one second. Yes, the one with the Kremlin on top, sorry. That one, thank you. Just a minute. Okay, so who are some of these core agencies and firms? Okay. So the Social Design Agency is a PR firm led by Russians that coordinates disinformation and campaigns across the region in Latin America. Structura, another firm, focuses on ensuring content that aligns with Kremlin priorities. Starting in 2022, these two firms implemented a campaign that impersonated news websites. Okay, so let me repeat that. They're impersonating news websites, okay? They stage videos and they fake social media accounts. SDA and Structura have implemented, on behalf of the Kremlin, an expansive network of more than 60 internet sites that impersonated real news organizations. They will actually create sites that resemble real news sites, and some people will think they're actually going to those sites, okay? And they will use misleading social media accounts to amplify the content of those fraudulent sites. According to the US government, these fake news sites appear to have been built
to carefully mimic the appearance of the real news sites, and they're using embedded images and working links to legitimize those sites, okay? They've even impersonated those sites' cookie acceptance pages, okay? So they do the best they can to actually manipulate people into thinking they're actually looking at the real thing. Okay, you also have the GRU. GRU is a Russian military intelligence unit specializing in active measures and cyber-enabled information operations. You have the FSB. This is the Federal Domestic Security Agency that, to some extent, replaced part of the KGB. They were involved. They were the agency that Alexander Litvinenko worked for before he was assassinated. Their role in all this is specializing political security and large-scale social media bot operations. Okay, then you have the Latka Project. Okay, what is the Latka Project? This was a Russian disinformation and intelligence operation formerly led by the Wagner Group, okay? They were also linked to an organization called The Company. This is a shadowy entity that operated a spy network inside Argentina and engaged in regional disinformation. Okay, I think if we could go back to slide 2, just for a moment. Actually, go to slide 6, I apologize. So that's slide 2, right? Okay. Okay. Okay, good. So RT in Espanol has extraordinary reach, as I told you before, with about 18 million Facebook followers. And they also have about 6 million YouTube subscribers. Okay, so what's its strategy? So part of their strategy is this RT Comparte initiative. They have workshops in Latin America that have trained about 1,000 journalists in 8 different Latin American countries with tools like source management and artificial intelligence. Those countries, of course, include the 3 communist dictatorships we're all too familiar with, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, but also countries with free economies such as Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico, our partner just south of the border, okay? These media partnerships establish links with local platforms such as the Mexican Journalist Club and Tells USA, which reaches 11 million households in Mexico. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Mexican Journalist Club, this is an organization that at one time was very credible, but over time it has become more and more saturated with Russian infiltration, and it's now becoming an example of how Moscow can hijack a legitimate organization and use its credibility in the political capital it's building within the industry and the region. This is a big aim of the Kremlin. They often try to target legitimate organizations, political organizations, journalistic societies. They invite journalists every year to a huge conference they have in Russia, in fact, called the Valdai Conference, where they shower them with gifts and interviews with important Russian officials. But they will do their best little by little to try to infiltrate some of these legitimate organizations because they know that people in these regions rely on them and they trust them. To that extent, they will localize content. They will repurpose this information. They will use former RT journalists, former Russian state journalists, and use them with Spanish language news channels to continue propagating narratives that align with the Kremlin's interests. Okay, they also use ambassadorial outreach. What do I mean by that? So they have ambassadors, of course, just like every country has ambassadors on location, but Russian ambassadors in some of these countries are playing a very high-profile role. You would be surprised at how well known they are throughout the country because they boost their presence through a lot of these Russian media interviews, okay? And they become like well-known spokespeople that people feel they can trust and rely on, okay? They are legitimized through spokespeople. They place op-eds. They write op-eds for a lot of major Latin American press, and they try to influence local outlets like La Jornada in Mexico and El Tiempo in Colombia. In Argentina, the ambassador there has emphasized the multipolar world and uses all kinds of different anti-colonial narratives to try to vilify the United States while also vilifying Ukraine as well. In Brazil, they've been promoting Russia as a partner for Brazil's quest for a permanent UN Security Council seat while pushing the denazification narrative about Ukraine. Okay, why does that help Russia to push this narrative about Ukraine in Latin America? The reason is they want to get support from their government. Okay, and it's a lot easier to get support from a Latin American government if you're actually convincing the people that this is a good policy, right? You're not going to get resistance from the population. The way to some extent, you've seen that here in the United States, a lot of people are very pro-Ukraine. But if you can turn people in Latin America against Ukraine, it's easier to get alliances from Latin America. Also in Colombia, they've been trying to praise government neutrality, but also criticizing local media for Western bias to try to bring the narrative closer to their own propaganda. Okay, I don't don't know if we can get to slide 7. Okay, so there are Russian intelligence networks. I just want to go over this briefly. In Argentina, like I said before, there was a network called The Company. Their objective was to form a group of individuals that were loyal to Russian interests and gathering political intelligence. In Mexico, there was an operation called Mexico No Perdona. This was discovered from seized documents. It turned out the SDA was involved in a campaign aimed at Mexico to encourage anti-sentiment and exacerbate confrontations between the U.S. and Mexico. I wrote a piece in the Washington Times recently about how much they were focusing on Mexico. Why? Obviously, they are a neighbor. They are trying to turn certain populations in Mexico and the United States against the U.S. government. They are actually targeting blue-collar sectors now, trying to convince people that tariffs will actually hurt industry and that the president's economic agenda is going to be very damaging to the Latin American region. Okay, so some of the dominant themes, as I talked about, we talk about the denazification of Ukraine, obviously ridiculous. If anyone is acting sort of in the spirit of the Third Reich here, it's Russia, which has committed one of the most significant Article 2.4 violations in recent history by invading its neighbor. They are not denazifying Ukraine. They are committing a genocide there. They also promote the anti-colonial, anti-imperial narrative, vilifying the United States as neo-colonial. They are also vilifying Western sanctions, of course, as global sabotage. If they can convince people in other countries that U.S. sanctions will hurt them, they have more of a chance of trying to get the U.S. to back off on sanctions against Moscow. Okay, and then, of course, U.S. interference. One of the things you might remember when the Ukraine invasion started was the vilification of the United States over biological labs. These labs are actually usually set up to try to prevent some kind of epidemic or outbreak, but instead they were falsely portrayed as germ warfare labs. And these narratives were pushed by Russian propaganda and then adopted by some fringe journalists in the United States. And for a while, there was a lot of confusion about that. Okay. If we could get to slide 10, we can tie it up with cyber and technical operations. Russia views the world locked in perpetual conflict, where the lines between war and peace are blurred. Okay, they use cyber-enabled active measures. They break information warfare really into two categories: information psychological warfare, which is conducted even in peacetime to conquer public opinion, and then information technology warfare, targeting IT systems that are usually used for hacking and leaking. You have certain sites like Guccifer 2.0, DC Leaks, and Cozy Bear. Some of you may not recall this, but during 2016, one of the things we found out was that Russia had actually infiltrated the U.S. election database. We don't have any evidence they manipulated votes, but they were actually watching the vote count as the database had votes coming in, okay? So the Russian campaign in Latin America is very well funded. It's a coordinated effort that is exploiting the region's open media environment. It's whitewashing propaganda through local journalists and influencers. And the Kremlin is successfully moving its narratives from state media into the organic discourse of Latin American society. We're seeing this with Wagner-linked networks in Argentina, the exposure of Operation Mexico No Perdona. These underscore the urgent security challenges posed by Moscow in the expanding intelligence and influence footprint in the Western Hemisphere. As I said before, anyone who thinks there's any difference between today's Russia and the Soviet Union is mistaken. The only difference is the Soviet Union focused mostly on targeting the left because a lot of their message resonated with the left. But today, they have been able to try to penetrate the right. And they are using the message of isolationism, non-interventionism, and anti-war messages to try to appeal to the fringe on both sides of the spectrum, because if you can appeal to both sides of the spectrum, that is how you consolidate power. And so I would say that their message is not political. It is not left or right. It is simply designed to serve its own purposes of a criminal and terrorist state that is looking to manipulate public opinion in our hemisphere. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y creo que podríamos continuar hablando un poco sobre cómo el rol que juega Rusia también en términos de Cuba. Me gustaría darle ahora paso a al doctor Orlando Gutiérrez-Boronat, del Directorio Democrático, uno de los grandes líderes de nuestra comunidad, y que ha trabajado muchísimo el papel que está jugando Cuba como aliado de Rusia en la guerra de Ucrania.
English, Spanish. Gracias por invitarme a este seminario tan importante con un tema que es clave. Y Le doy las gracias a ADN, a Helen, a Jeffrey por invitarme a hablar de este tema. Y también quiero reconocer la presencia en el salón de dos personas que están lidiando con este tema constantemente. Uno es el doctor René Bolio, de la Comisión Mexicana de Derechos Humanos, que es una organización que está al frente de la lucha por la libertad, por la democracia, por la verdad, frente a la influencia tanto China como Rusia en México, y Luis Zúñiga, con el cual hemos desarrollado un trabajo constante en esa dirección. Si ustedes me permiten, yo quisiera, antes de entrar en lo de Cuba, hablar de esta excelente presentación que ha hecho Jeffrey Shapiro, porque yo les quiero hacer tres aportes en esa dirección. Número uno, detrás de todo esto, quizás no hay una ideología, pero sí hay una teoría. Una teoría de cómo desestabilizar y romper los vínculos internos de la hegemonía occidental. Esa teoría la formula un individuo que ha adquirido una fama casi legendaria, que es Alexander Dugin. Dugin, en su obra, señala, número uno, la necesidad de una estrategia post-ideológica rusa que fuera más allá de los antiguos entornos de la Guerra Fría hacia la nueva realidad de Rusia. Y que esta estrategia tenía que abarcar un frente muy amplio de todo aquello que se opusiera a la hegemonía de la élite, de lo que él llama la élite angloamericana que gobierna el mundo. La Unión del Atlántico, que es como él se refiere. Dice, básicamente, los ingleses con su influencia en Europa, los americanos con su influencia en el resto del mundo, han estado gobernando un mundo donde durante 150, 200 años hay que romper eso. ¿Cómo lo rompemos? Entonces, precisamente lo que plantea Dugin es que el esfuerzo por crear un mundo diferente acabó con la Unión Soviética, quebró la Unión Soviética. Entonces lo que dice Dugin es, nosotros no podemos crear un mundo nuevo. Eso requiere un nivel de energía y de esfuerzo que no tenemos. Lo que sí podemos hacer es impedir que la élite angloamericana cree o funde su orden. Acaba de lograr la consolidación del orden institucional democrático que empezó después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Y para eso, dice él, como bien dijo Jeffrey, la alternativa es un mundo multipolar donde Rusia sea la cabeza. Pero ese mundo multipolar tiene que estar dispuesto a vivir en el caos. Y él dice, el caos es saludable, el caos es bueno, la creación, la belleza, todo viene en el caos. Estaba, por cierto, citando a Che Guevara cuando decía eso, a Ernesto Guevara, de que del caos, esto de la dieta fascista, de que el caos viene la creación, viene todo lo bueno, y que Rusia debe promover un caos mundial, una desestabilización permanente en el mundo que impida y desgaste al orden angloamericano. Pero para poder hacer esto, los rusos han percibido una tensión y una narrativa que yo creo que está debajo de la superficie de las cuatro que identificó Jeffrey. Y la narrativa que ellos han identificado, que también existe dentro de Estados Unidos, es la diferencia entre lo que se llama el tradicionalismo o el perennialismo y el modernismo. Sobre todo en la región de América Latina, cuya cultura fundamental sigue siendo el catolicismo. Hay una tensión muy grande internamente entre lo que se llama el modernismo, es decir, incorporar a la Iglesia Católica las formas, los puntos de vista, las perspectivas, la cultura del mundo después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, con todo lo que eso implica, y el tradicionalismo, que es defender y mantener lo que ha sido la tradición fundamental católica. Lo interesante es que en todas las culturas del mundo hay una lucha similar entre tradicionalismo y modernismo. En el Islam, en el hinduismo, todo. Entonces Dugin dice, Rusia se tiene que presentar como la nación líder del tradicionalismo, la que defiende una serie de tradiciones y formas de hacer las cosas que son anteriores a y superiores moralmente al modernismo que impulsa Estados Unidos, la élite europea y el Reino Unido. Y esa lucha entre el tradicionalismo y el modernismo, que es muy real, eso no es algo que inventaron los rusos, eso está ocurriendo. Lo vemos dentro de la misma Iglesia Católica, la tensión entre el Papa Francisco y Opus Dei y la Santa Sociedad de San Pío X, por ejemplo, es una tensión real. Pero la inteligencia rusa ha sido clave en decir, esta tensión nosotros la operamos, como bien señaló Jeffrey en la presentación, desde la reacción. voy a aterrizar esto. ¿Qué quiero decir por esto? A Rusia le es muy difícil persuadir a gente en América Latina que una nación poderosa, un estado imperial, como dice Putin que es Rusia, un estado de civilización, está en lo correcto cuando invade un país pequeño como Ucrania. Número uno. Número dos, le es muy difícil a Rusia arguir en contra del valor de los ucranianos, porque en la cultura latina el valor personal es algo fundamental. Lo que sí ha sido muy efectiva Rusia es en crear la visión de que Zelensky es parte del modernismo. Zelensky es parte del woke. Y entonces cuando uno viaja en América Latina te encuentras personas que uno piensa que están anticomunistas, anti-China, anti-Rusia, que te dicen, no, pero cuidado con Zelensky. Zelensky es de los otros, de los que se nos oponen, los modernistas. Él está detrás de la Agenda 2030. Él es parte de ese mundo. Y para poder montar ese argumento, Rusia muy inteligentemente, voy a ver cómo digo esto, la ortodoxia es una denominación cristiana, una iglesia cristiana apostólica a la cual le tenemos el mayor respeto, pero Rusia muy inteligentemente promueve la ortodoxia, siempre y cuando no sea ucraniana, como una alternativa real al catolicismo vegetariano que está siendo rechazado por muchos en América Latina y en el mundo. Entonces, la promoción de la idea imperial rusa, la promoción de la ortodoxia y desde lugares que no sean Rusia. Desde puntos de influencia de la ortodoxia que no están en Rusia. Por eso esa batalla tan dura que hemos visto en Ucrania entre ortodoxos ucranianos y ortodoxos rusos, eso tiene todo que ver con la política y la identidad y la razón de esta guerra. Han sido muy hábiles los rusos en combinar el apoyo a sus aliados tradicionales, Nicaragua, y fíjense cómo la estrategia de Ortega es muy parecida a la rusa. En Cuba, en Irán y otros regímenes que se le acercan. Y todo es parte de la estrategia esta perennialista de Dugin, de hay un corazón de culturas que se opone a ser cambiadas y transformadas por las corrientes nuevas del mundo occidental que son inmorales, son antihumanas, y eso es lo que Rusia tiene que crear. Y yo creo que el gran avance que ha tenido Rusia en la región es ese. Otro gran avance que ha tenido Rusia es que los embajadores rusos son personalidades y están activos, las embajadas están activas. Y lo que dicen es, nosotros no somos comunistas. Lo que no queremos es que ocurra esto y esto y esto con nuestra familia, nuestra cultura, nuestra civilización. Algunos de los puntos que ellos dicen pueden tener razón. Lo que no tienen razón es que detrás de eso está la manipulación de un Estado imperial que quiere dominar el mundo mediante su visión autoritaria del mundo. Y un Estado extremadamente peligroso como hemos visto. En el caso de Cuba, vemos la cercanía del régimen castrista con Irán, la cercanía del régimen castrista con Rusia a nivel religioso, la presencia del patriarca ortodoxo ruso en Cuba. Todo es el régimen castrista intentando calcar o aproximarse a ese nuevo eje de fundamento religioso, espiritual, cultural que está haciendo Rusia. Porque ciertamente el régimen castrista es un instrumento vital y clave del Estado ruso. Y por cierto, no me viene a la memoria ningún acuerdo entre rusos y americanos que beneficiara al pueblo cubano. Ni el pacto Kennedy-Khrushchev, que fue una maldad de Kennedy, un crimen contra el pueblo cubano lo que hizo Kennedy. Ni el acuerdo por la base de submarinos de Cienfuegos, que también fue un golpe al exilio cubano tremendo. Entonces tenemos toda la razón del mundo de preocuparnos sobre estas conversaciones porque Rusia sabe cuál es su prioridad. Su prioridad es defender al régimen castrista. Por eso yo creo que es tan importante que entendamos las raíces culturales, las raíces religiosas de la estrategia rusa, que en fin de cuentas el Estado ruso es un Estado ruso rápidamente yendo del autoritarismo al totalitarismo. En fin de cuentas lo que tiene es una visión del poder, no una doctrina, no una moral. Putin puede ser antiaborto en un momento dado porque no le conviene a Rusia el aborto por el colapso de la tasa de natalidad rusa, pero no le importa simultáneamente apoyar movimientos pro aborto en cualquier parte del mundo. O sea, aquí no hay un eje moral, aquí hay un eje de poder. Un eje de poder que comprende muy bien el fenómeno religioso, el fenómeno cultural, enfrentándose a universidades americanas y europeas que hace mucho tiempo, bajo la influencia castrista, decidieron que la religión y el espíritu y la cultura no eran importantes en la historia, que todo era economía. Y están frente a un Estado muy antiguo, con gente muy capacitada que entienden esos detalles esas particularidades de toda lucha que se remontan a lo cultural y lo espiritual y lo religioso. Así que ese es mi aporte y gracias por invitarme para hablar de eso.
Muchísimas gracias, Orlando. Me gustaría ahora darle la bienvenida a David Satter. David es un periodista e historiador estadounidense que lleva pues toda su vida escribiendo sobre Rusia y la Unión Soviética, vivió muchos años allá. Además, fue el primer periodista de Estados Unidos, primer periodista norteamericano en ser expulsado de Rusia por Putin. Ha sido autor de libros y artículos muy importantes sobre la caída de la Unión Soviética, sobre el surgimiento de la Rusia postsoviética, y él va a explicar un poco la mentalidad y los grupos también criminales que han tomado Rusia y por qué después de la caída de la Unión Soviética este eje para desestabilizar las sociedades occidentales continúa. Gracias. Thank you, David.
Okay. Well, good day. I'm very glad to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you. This is not my first visit to this museum. I was here a couple of years ago to talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. And perhaps it's worthwhile now to recall the experience of the Soviet Union, because when we face Russian disinformation, we're also faced with, in fact, a mystery. It's a reasonable person would ask, why is Russia hostile to the rest of the world? What does it have against the West? What is their grievance? It was understandable during the Soviet period because the Soviets were motivated by communist ideology. Communism was directed specifically against the outside world, and Marx and Engels, the principal authors of communist ideology, said that very specifically that our goal is to destroy the existing bourgeois world and to create a new proletarian world which would be better, freer, more just, and in general something akin to paradise on earth. But communism was discredited in Russia. In fact, the Soviet Union collapsed as a result of an largely peaceful anti-communist revolution. The people who came to power, including Yeltsin and those around him, claimed that they were radical anti-communists, and that their goal was to recreate the kind of capitalist system that had existed in Russia before the revolution and was obviously flourishing in the West. There are other reasons for being perplexed. For one thing, the United States and the other countries of the West were very friendly toward Russia and very anxious to give Russia all the economic and technical assistance that it needed. In fact, many of the components of Russian weapons that are now being used against Ukraine, they came from us. The care and caution that had characterized the West's attitude toward the Soviet Union was largely abandoned after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Western firms did not hesitate to trade in technology with Russia and to provide it with the means of building up its armed forces. It's also strange if you look at the situation geopolitically, because Russia is faced with a neighbor, China, that is 10 times its size in terms of population. It is much more economically dynamic, and has territorial claims against Russia. Chinese have never given up their claims to large parts of Russia that were acquired by Russia as a result of what the Chinese call the unequal treaties that were imposed on the Chinese emperors by the Tsar. Under these circumstances, it stands to reason that Russia would consider its national interest to be best served with an alliance with the Western countries, all the more to counterbalance Chinese power. But none of these factors have had any effect on Russia's anti-Western position. All logic says that the welfare of Russia, the welfare of the Russian people, depends on a close alliance with the West. But in fact, Russia has chosen to ally not with the West, but with China, North Korea, Iran, and other countries that are anti-democratic and anti-Western. Well, how to explain this very strange fact? Well, the mystery is not as difficult to understand, is not as difficult as people might think. The reason why Russia has chosen to side not with the West, but with the enemies of the West, is because when communism fell in Russia, the government which took power was not democratic. It only pretended to be. In reality, what happened was that Russia was taken over by criminals. In 1991, in August, there was an attempt by elements of the Soviet leadership who were connected to the KGB to seize power. Gorbachev, you may remember, those of you who were following events at that time, was removed, and in effect a junta called the Committee on the Extraordinary Situation took power. And this group claimed that they were going to restore normality after 5 years of democratic reforms in Russia. What they didn't calculate on was that during those years of so-called perestroika and glasnost, the Soviet Union became a different country. People suddenly became politically active. There was an aspiration to a change. People hoped for a better way of life. And when they saw these supporters of the Soviet regime, of the communist regime, which had been thoroughly discredited as a result of glasnost and free information, when they saw that they intended to take power and turn back the clock, thousands and thousands of people descended on Moscow to defend the headquarters of the Russian government under Boris Yeltsin, which had become the center of opposition to the Soviet government, which was of course based on communism and which which in fact was trying to survive. But during those very tense days when it appeared that democracy, the democratic movement in the Soviet Union would be destroyed, what many people didn't notice was that among the crowds that were opposed to this coup, in addition to the young people, the intellectuals, the middle-class people who wanted a better life, in the crowds were also large numbers of criminals. People who were there at the time noticed how many criminal types were in the crowd. And in fact, the criminal world was 100% on the side of Yeltsin. And when the Soviet Union fell, it was the criminals who took power. It was a natural progression because Yeltsin interpreted Westernization and democratization as simply the transformation of the economic system without any attention to the rule of law. And what took place in Russia was the largest transfer of property, peaceful transfer of property, probably in world history. And it took place without law, without rules, without ethics. And of course, the process was dominated by criminals. One of the most active people in St. Petersburg was someone no one at that time had ever heard of, a guy by the name of Vladimir Putin, who was the liaison between the criminal world and the local government in St. Petersburg. Later, those ties were to make him a candidate for president. But during the 1990s, the criminalization of Russia completely impoverished 99% of the population and created enormous wealth for a tiny minority. The conditions in Russia were worse than anything that existed during the Soviet Union. There's a term that demographers use. It's called surplus mortality. That means the level of mortality that could not be predicted on the basis of pre-existing trends. During the 1990s, that figure was 6 million. 6 million people in Russia. The excess deaths from suicide, murder, accidents, and just general despair, a lack of decent medical care, was 6 million people. It was a disaster for the country. Many people talk about the excitement of the 1990s without referring to the number of people who didn't survive the 1990s. So when in 1999 it came time for new elections, against this background, no one practically in Russia among the ordinary people supported the criminal regime. Public opinion polls showed that Yeltsin had the support of 2% of the population. His appointed successor, Vladimir Putin, was also supported by 2% of the population. And during that summer in Moscow in 1999, and I was there, when it was clear that according to the Constitution there would have to be a new election, and the opposition side was saying that they would re-examine the privatization process, which means basically that they would try to seize, not that they were going to give property back to the people, but rather that they would find a way to seize it for themselves. And at that point, apartment buildings in Moscow began to be blown up in the middle of the night, and in other Russian cities. These bombings were blood. Hundreds of people were killed, and the panic spread through the entire country. People in every Russian city were getting up to guard their buildings for fear that someone would put a bomb in the basement and blow up the building, and they would die. They would go to sleep and not wake up. Putin, who had been appointed prime minister and who was completely unknown, he had no political experience, no charisma, no reputation, no ability to speak in public, was appointed the leader of the military operation against Chechnya. Chechens were accused of blowing up the buildings, and Putin depicted himself as the savior of the nation. Well, as a result of this, he succeeded in winning the April 2000 presidential elections, and as we know, he's been in power ever since. The evidence that these bombings were carried out not by the Chechens, but by the government itself, including Putin, is overwhelming and it's incontrovertible. The reason why the United States and other countries, and this goes to the question of disinformation, did not raise the issue of who bombed these buildings is simply because it was so terrible that they could not imagine that human beings would be capable of bombing their own people in order to come to power. There was ample evidence. A fifth bomb was found in a building in Ryazan, and it was defused before it could blow up the building. And the people who put the bomb in the building were caught, and they weren't Chechen terrorists. They were agents of the KGB. Not only that, the Speaker of the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, by mistake on September 13th announced that a building in the city of Volgodonsk had been blown up in the middle of the night. In fact, a building had been blown up on September 13th. It was in Moscow on the Kashirskaya Chaussee. The building in Volgodonsk was blown up 3 days later. It was never explained how he knew on September 13th why he was announcing a bombing on September 13th that only took place on September 16th if it hadn't been planned by the authorities themselves. Everything that happened in the years of Putin's control in Russia, which has become tighter and tighter, the numerous atrocities that were planned and organized as KGB provocations included 2002, the seizure of the theater on Dubrovka, in which 1,000 people were taken hostage, and the theater was gassed, and there were nearly 200 people who died as a result of the release of poison gas in the theater. All evidence shows that the persons who carried out the hostage taking were connected to the security services. The same in 2004 with the Beslan school massacre. Russians carried out the shooting down of MH17, an international Malaysian airliner on a flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. They claimed that it was separatists who were firing at Ukrainian fighter planes, but there were no Ukrainian fighter planes in the air at that time, only passenger planes. And the separatists denied that they were the ones who fired the fatal shot. And all evidence suggests that, in fact, that in this at least, they're telling the truth. So the question really answers itself. A regime that uses these tactics, that is afraid of its own people, that is run by criminals is obviously incompatible with the West, and for reasons of its own survival is forced to engage in massive disinformation, among other tactics, in order to undermine its potential opponents, if those opponents have the moral wherewithal to understand the challenge that they face. It was this that motivated the Russia-Ukraine war. This was a preventable war. It was preventable, because any realistic understanding of what's going on in Russia would have warned the West of the need to resist, and to resist forcefully, Russia's various demands, including the demand that Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO. So Russian disinformation is a potent weapon, and it in fact has facilitated a great deal of what we're seeing in the world today. Our task, I think, is to understand what it is, to understand that the people who are propagating it don't believe it, because they don't believe in truth as an enduring concept, but rather truth as whatever it is that serves their interests. I know personally many of the people who are promoting Russian disinformation. I've met them. I knew them in the 90s, knew them at various times. They don't believe a word they're saying. And if the circumstances changed, they would say they would start saying exactly the opposite. So this kind of fog of lies is a challenge to Latin America. It's a challenge to the United States. Obviously, there's a hope in Russia that Latin America can be used against the United States, but under the present situation, with the Trump administration, the disinformation is being very successful with the American government itself. But nonetheless, with this background, I hope it becomes clear to people that anything that emanates from RT and Español or Sputnik is not truthful information, is not honest information, and has one intention only, and that's to undermine the values of the West. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Nuestro próximo panelista, para concluir, y vamos a abrir algunas preguntas después, cuando terminemos, es John Suárez. Es el director ejecutivo del Centro para una Cuba Libre, el Center for a Free Cuba. Fue oficial, además de programas de América Latina en Freedom House durante muchos años, y es un defensor de una transición no violenta hacia una Cuba que pues respete las libertades políticas y económicas, y ha hecho un trabajo de investigación muy amplio sobre todas las redes del régimen cubano, también para articularse dentro de la propaganda internacional.
También quiero reconocer, porque tengo mi ex jefe aquí, Orlando Gutiérrez-Boronat, que también fui miembro y soy miembro del Directorio Democrático Cubano, y sumamente agradecido por el tiempo que pasé trabajando con él como mi jefe. Y gracias por la invitación. Las narrativas y la desinformación tienen una relación simbólica de independencia que hace que las primeras actúen de andamiaje capaz de hacer de la información falsa o engañosa algo creíble y persuasiva, mientras que la desinformación se refiere a hechos falsos, concretos o eventos fabricados. Una narrativa es la historia general o el lente que da significado a estos hechos. Por ejemplo, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin escribió en 1916 y publicó en 1917 el libro Imperialismo, fase superior del capitalismo. En esta obra, el revolucionario ruso definió el imperialismo como la etapa final y monopolista del capitalismo, caracterizada por la dominación global del capital financiero, los carteles y la división del mundo entre naciones ricas. Permítanme subrayar esta idea repitiendo la cita del capítulo 7 de su obra. Entre comillas, si fuera necesario dar la definición más breve posible del imperialismo, tendríamos que decir que el imperialismo es la etapa monopolista del capitalismo. Cierro la cita. Sin embargo, los historiadores profesionales señalan que el primer imperio de la historia fue el imperio acadio, entre el año 2334 antes del nacimiento de Cristo hasta el año 154 antes del nacimiento de Cristo, ubicado en lo que hoy es el centro de Irak. El imperio acadio no era capitalista, sino al contrario, es considerado como uno de los más tempranos estados de economía planificada o dirigida. El estado se sustentaba en la autoridad de un rey, un ejército de burócratas y la fuerza militar, no un sistema de libre mercado. La definición del imperialismo que hace Lenin omite la historia de imperios que tenían características similares a los regímenes de Moscú, Pekín y La Habana. Su definición crea una narrativa según la cual las democracias occidentales con sistemas de mercado son inherentemente imperialistas, mientras que los regímenes comunistas no lo son por definición, al no ser capitalistas. Esta narrativa falsa constituye el fundamento de la campaña de desinformación de los regímenes comunistas para demonizar a las democracias occidentales y sus sistemas del mercado. Definen las democracias como sistemas inherentemente inclinados al imperialismo y, por el contrario, rechazan la posibilidad de que los propios regímenes comunistas pueden ser imperialistas. El 13 de enero del 2026, en el Museo de las Víctimas del Comunismo en Washington, D.C., el Centro por una Cuba Libre, la Fundación Víctimas del Comunismo, organizaron la conferencia 60 años del terror cubano, como La Habana, con la Tricontinental de 1966, construyó una red global de terror, donde presenté una ponencia centrada en las contradicciones del antiimperialismo cubano. En mi intervención comencé proporcionando información básica, que lo voy a repetir aquí. La conferencia tricontinental, celebrada en La Habana entre el 3 al 16 de enero de 1966, fue el origen de la Organización de la Solidaridad de los Pueblos de Asia, África y América Latina, OSPAL. Aunque durante 6 décadas proclamó dirigir sus esfuerzos a apoyar a grupos revolucionarios y terroristas en Europa, África, América y Asia, con el objetivo declarado de luchar contra el imperialismo, en la práctica se dedicó a subvertir democracias y atacar regímenes autoritarios no comunistas. Aunque correcta, mi presentación fue superficial. Afortunadamente, este encuentro me brinda otra oportunidad para profundizar en el otro legado de la tricontinental, el rescate de la narrativa falsa preexistente que sistematizó y potenció difundiendo desinformación a mayor escala durante los últimos 60 años, causando un gran daño a la causa de la libertad y la civilización. De alguna forma, hemos subestimado el nivel del ataque sistemático y continuo de Moscú a la civilización occidental y su legado bolchevique de 110 años. Sin embargo, no deben ignorarse los papeles desempeñados también por el castrismo y el maoísmo en la configuración del resultado final. He estado revisando literatura y archivos sobre el tricontinental y se evidencia una triangulación clara entre 2 superpotencias y una potencia regional que competían por el control mayor, poder y influencia. La conferencia tricontinental desempeñó un papel en la globalización, sistematización y difusión del relato selectivo del imperialismo enmarcada por Lenin y la Unión Soviética. Instrumentalizó la definición de Lenin para atacar el imperialismo yanqui occidental mientras protegía a los estados comunistas y sus aliados de esa etiqueta. Este evento enterró un marco de desinformación asimétrica en los movimientos de liberación del tercer mundo, redes de izquierda y el discurso global antioccidental con ecos institucionales y culturales que persisten hasta la actualidad. Las declaraciones, resoluciones y discursos de la conferencia encuadraron el imperialismo como lo hizo Lenin en 1916-17, como la etapa monopolista del capitalismo, centrada en el capital financiero occidental, la explotación neocolonial y la agresión militar. El discurso de clausura de Fidel Castro calificó al imperialismo yanqui como el centro, eje y principal sostén de la dominación global, uniendo a los delegados en la lucha contra él, mientras presentaba la solidaridad socialista como su antídoto. El mensaje de Che Guevara, leído en voz alta en esa reunión, instaba severamente a crear 2-3 mucho Vietnams para rodear y derrotar a las democracias occidentales. Tanto Pekín como Moscú asistieron a la conferencia tricontinental con delegaciones gubernamentales inmensas, pero la ruptura sino-soviética era ya visible. Los discursos y maniobras incluyeron pullas y recriminaciones, mientras ambas potencias competían por el liderazgo del frente antiimperialista. Los maoístas no boicotearon ni abandonaron la conferencia. Por el contrario, prefirieron participar para superar a los soviéticos en ideología y organización. Los delegados chinos impulsaron el marco leninista del imperialismo como la fase superior del capitalismo, centrado en el capital financiero y la agresión de Estados Unidos y Occidente, y rechazaron cualquier tentación de apaciguamiento por parte de los soviéticos mediante expresiones como coexistencia pacífica, considerada capitulación por Pekín. Un delegado chino declaró: la conferencia tricontinental debe discutir la unidad de los pueblos de los 3 continentes en la lucha contra el imperialismo y no la cuestión de la coexistencia pacífica. Pekín, junto con La Habana, insistió en que la conferencia se centrara en la lucha armada popular contra el imperialismo estadounidense, como enemigo declarado de los pueblos del mundo y gendarme internacional, apoyando el derecho a la revolución y la guerra popular. Moscú habría querido establecer la OSPAL en el Cairo, pero Pekín logró que se ubicara en La Habana. Al radicalizar la retórica y consolidar a La Habana como centro, Pekín contribuyó a globalizar esta falsa dicotomía entre los movimientos de liberación de África hacia América Latina. Las resoluciones de la conferencia y las publicaciones de la OSPAL, carteles, boletines, difundieron el marco leninista. Democracia de mercado occidentales son iguales a imperialistas por naturaleza. Estados socialistas comunistas son iguales a los liberadores sin autocrítica. Esto significaba que no se condenarían la ocupación china del Tíbet, el genocidio en curso contra los uigures, las amenazas de Pekín a invadir a Taiwán, ni su negativa a reconocer su derecho a la autodeterminación, ni tampoco la iniciativa de la Franja y la Ruta, descrita como diplomacia de la trampa de la deuda que obliga a países en desarrollo a ceder activos estratégicos a cambio de alivio financiero. Por el contrario, La Habana lideró de forma constante esfuerzos diplomáticos en Naciones Unidas para defender las acciones de China y evitar el escrutinio internacional. También apoyó las iniciativas coloniales y neocoloniales de Moscú, participando en atrocidades que alcanzan el nivel de genocidio. Pekín y Moscú no socavaron la narrativa compartida, intensificaron la competencia por erigirse como el líder antiimperialista más puro. Esta dinámica hizo la desinformación más potente. Las audiencias del tercer mundo recibieron un mensaje unificado que justificaba las expansiones de Pekín y Moscú mientras demonizaba y aún demonizan a Occidente. Gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por venir. Podemos abrir para algunas preguntas, si gustan. Yo sé que hay muchas cosas además que están pasando actualmente. John mencionaba la tricontinental y casualmente eso es algo que ha estado en gran debate en Estados Unidos por estos grupos, que todavía la Tricontinental existe, por ejemplo, hoy en día como un centro de pensamiento, de investigación, que está financiado por grandes intereses aquí en Estados Unidos, sobre todo por una persona que tiene un fondo de más de 500 millones de dólares que lo ha destinado a muchas organizaciones sin fines de lucro en Estados Unidos, que están detrás de muchas de las protestas que estamos viendo, que si bien no estamos quitando el mérito de las ideas que puedan tener unos u otros que salen a protestar por una visión determinada, lo que hemos tratado con esta conferencia también es desde el punto de vista histórico, pero aterrizarlo un poco a esto no ha concluido, esto continúa hoy aquí para tratar de explotar esas divisiones que normalmente los seres humanos, debates que podemos tener, y continúa más allá de la parte de propaganda y de la narrativa, también continúa influyendo en muchos grupos que lo que buscan es la subversión. Entonces estamos viendo hoy en día muchas agencias también de inteligencia que han reportado sobre eso, que muchos de los movimientos que vemos hoy en día no es que no sean orgánicos necesariamente, sino que son cooptados por estos grupos que están aliados tanto Irán como China, como Rusia, por supuesto La Habana, y que lo que buscan es pues ponernos a pelear, socavar nuestra democracia, la confianza en nuestras instituciones. Y bueno, esperamos que haya sido haya sido del interés no solo de ustedes, sino también de las personas con que estamos compartiendo este evento virtual, y que sirva un poco pues para aclarar muchas veces lo que vemos en redes sociales y las ramificaciones que está teniendo esto en nuestra sociedad. Si tienen alguna pregunta, creo que tienen el micrófono por aquí. Yes. And I can translate if it's...
This might be a safer way to do this. You had a question?
Trump just allowed Putin to send a boat full of oil to Cuba. From your presentation, Cuba and Russia are in bed together. As people here, what can we do? Is there anything we can do on a daily basis to be against all this bad information? That's my question.
Well, I think there is something that you can do. I actually think that you can engage in what Ayn Rand called intellectual activism, which is actually talking with the people that you know in your community. I know that sounds very simple, but there are so few people that are aware of this. And some of you in the audience, especially those of you that we personally invited, you have incredible influence in this community. The fact of the matter is you did. It's one of the reasons we invited you to be here. And those of you who are not engaged in activism otherwise, or some of these academic circles, you still know many people. And with social media, I see people amplifying stories every day. They amplify stories about their cat, they amplify stories about what happened at work. These kinds of articles, though, these kinds of conferences, this kind of information, this is something you could help in amplifying. You can also write letters to the editor.
You can write op-ed pieces and submit them to newspapers. There are ways you can get information out. But one of the most important things you can do is continue to be aware. Continue to try to detect these kinds of messages. One of the things that I didn't talk about, one of the other speakers may have, though, I know we talked about many things today, is how, quite frankly, Russia is using anti-Semitism as a unifying message. Why? Because it appeals to the fringe on both the left and the right. Again, I talked about consolidation of power, right? If you can get to the fringe on the left and the right, and you can convince them, hey, we feel the way you feel about this group, therefore you should trust us with these other issues. That's how they're relating to people, right? And anti-Semitism, sadly, is usually a safe bet when you're dealing with people who are on the fringe or on the radical right, or the left. So continue to be aware and continue to spread that message. I think this is actually a good question for Dr. Gutierrez and Mr. Suarez to answer. So I'm going to ask them would they like to say anything about this. Up here. Take your chances with that if you like.
create a narrative that is subconsciously convincing. So, for example, I have found repeatedly in Latin America this idea of the Russian armies defending Christendom, attacking the heathen Ukrainians, and that is so distant from reality. You know, when you ride into Ukraine, you see one church after another. They're deeply spiritual people. Their willingness to sacrifice for a higher ideal is tremendous, and yet the image being created is all the contrary, and it's being created among people who don't make an effort to find out what truth is. So I think that in response to your question, don't take things as social media presents them. Look them up, find out what's really there, and access the true historical information. And I think something we need to tell our kids: just don't accept what the phone tells you. You have to go and you have to dig in and find out and make sure that what you're being told is a certainty. So I think I offend people because when they bring me news, I go, where'd you see it? No, social media. Okay, look it up. Let's make sure it's true, because I don't trust anything that comes out on social media. I have to go and I have to make sure that it's real, especially with AI.
I would also say, even with the
Push the button. I think it's on the right.
all right
On top.
on top.
No, maybe not.
No, but I think that it's not only social media. I mean, the New York Times had its own history with Mr. Herbert Matthews, Mr. Walter Duranty, who covered up genocides. So I do think that looking at multiple sources, doing due diligence, but at the same time, where you have the ability through your own social networks to communicate basic messages to your online communities, that's indispensable, because the other side is doing it. And frankly, the analog world of letters to the editor, op-eds is still important, but also getting into Facebook, onto X, Instagram, and putting out your message, verbalizing it, because a lot of people don't read. And one of the things that terrifies me for our democracy is generations growing up that have been going to school and getting tablets and not reading books. This is a sign that I've truly gotten old, because I'm now complaining about, the current days, not the good old days. But I think that's a concern. So I'd say also recommend your kids read a book. Helps develop the brain to be able to think through
I'll answer the next
these false messages, which if you're not prepared with analytical reasoning, you're more easily going to succumb to.
Si alguien más tiene alguna pregunta, por supuesto.
Hola, buenos días. Lo digo primero en español y después lo voy a decir en inglés. Recientemente estaba hablando con unos funcionarios de una compañía de redes que básicamente lo que dijeron fue que reconocimos que los redes tienen mucha información falsa, pero que la responsabilidad de ellos era a los que son dueños de sus acciones. Y después dijeron algo que fue muy alarmante, que dijeron, no sabemos cómo parar. Recently I've spoken to some members of a company, a social media company. They said, look, our responsibility is primarily to our shareholders. Number two, we know it's an echo chamber, and we know this is bad, but we don't know how to stop it. Maybe perhaps a point of attack is with them somehow. What are your thoughts on that? Any of the panelists come up with?
You're talking about the social media networks themselves?
Yes, it's becoming an echo chamber. They're aware of it, but they'd rather hold their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and stop it. So we'll discuss it today.
So for those watching, the question was about the responsibility of social media sites themselves. That's a very interesting question. Obviously, being a lawyer, in fact, my thesis in law school in internet law was about Section 230 in the Communications Decency Act, which really immunizes a lot of these ISPs and social media sites from liability, because the notion was that it was going to be impossible to regulate, right? And we didn't want to put unfair restrictions on something that I think they phrased was going to be a competitive and vibrant new field on the internet. We didn't want to restrict speech. But what you're seeing now, and what you saw with Twitter, and what you're seeing across the board, is a lot of these social media sites have actually exercised restraint. They do have the ability. And to some extent, they have done it. They have tried in some circumstances to try to curb foreign influence. But I think you're going to see a transformation over the next few years. You're going to see Congress starting to re-examine Section 230
which immunizes these sites. And they're going to have to make a decision. Either they have the bandwidth to engage or they don't, because some of them, as you know, they've been criticized for engaging politically, right? There are some people who feel that some of these sites have, I don't want to say censored, but sort of moderated and to some extent given some sites more attention and less attention, putting some sites into the feed and less attention for others depending on their politics. So they've clearly demonstrated they do have the ability to some extent to monitor and regulate. I do think it is a challenging situation because of how many people are on the internet. I think it's going to take a lot of research, a lot of studies, but I do think you are going to see some congressional oversight in that area, and we could be getting into a place now where the Communications Decency Act that was passed about 3 decades ago is overhauled or at least reviewed. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Career in marketing, and one of the holy grails of marketing is being able to offer up that messaging to a customer based on, let's say, their entire digital footprint that's tailored to them and a tailored message. How close, let's say, are they to that level of sophistication?
Well, you've heard this phrase before, the future is now. I don't think it's ever been more true. I'm very interested in what you're saying because I've been reading a lot about artificial intelligence lately, and the things that I've been learning have just been shocking to me. I was actually talking to a doctor recently who's an ophthalmologist, and he was explaining the incredible advancements in the area of medical research and machinery and technology. And the technology that they have now, just the ability to do optical scanning and identification is incredible. The government's been doing it since 1984 internally. But you've seen this in science fiction movies. I think it's going to become a reality pretty soon. You're probably going to be living in a society where there's optical scanning in public, and they're going to be able to track people, okay? So just to answer your question, we are getting to a point where artificial intelligence is taking us to a capacity where we're going to be able to detect things we never did before. How that's going to affect foreign influence and their ability to penetrate us remains to be seen. But you raise an interesting point because it could be on some level raising our ability to defend ourselves if we're vigilant. But it all comes down to what our priorities are. And you are seeing sort of an increase in interest, I think, in Congress among members in terms of the impact that foreign influence is having. But as I spoke before, Russia is severely outspending us. It's amazing how much they've put into this machine and how little we have here. We have people at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Voice of America, Radio Marti that are doing the best that they can, but they can only fight with the weapons they're armed with by Congress and the White House. And so I think that we need to try to give the people who are combating foreign influence the weapons they need. I think the technology is there. I just think we need to have the funding behind it.
They have the ability to track our behavior to an extent that sometimes it's not even legal to do on the West. So I definitely think a lot of that because of the reliance on algorithms that we have in social media, that Russia has definitely created a lot of technology that is very sophisticated at deploying, because we have that technology. I mean, in the U.S., right? You have platforms in the U.S. where you can track so much data about people. Sometimes that is a technology that is not open source, it's not open to everyone to use, but our government definitely has it. So the Russians had invested a lot of time in that, and they're really ahead of time in many areas in terms of cyber threat and cyber security.
Yes.
Yes, I'll say my question in both languages, and I would like all the panelists
Sure.
to weigh into whatever capacity. So we saw recently the CNN interview with Sandro Castro, right? A child of the Castro family that is now claiming that he is supposedly capitalist, that he would have made a deal with Trump already if that was the case. I definitely do think that there is a psychological operation, in my own personal opinion, being formulated with these kinds of actions. But I would love for experts such as yourself in understanding the intelligence capacity of the Castro regime as well as the KGB as to what this could entail in this transitionary time and how us as youth should mentally prepare ourselves for these kinds of operations, ¿verdad? La pregunta es que ahora vimos la entrevista en CNN con Sandro Castro, que ahora supuestamente está saliendo como capitalista, que está dispuesto a tener algún tipo de negociaciones con la administración de Trump. ¿Qué es esto? Esto es una operación psicológica de qué capacidad y cómo nosotros jóvenes cubanos y americanos deberíamos procesar esta entrevista.
I'm going to start with Mr. Suarez, and we'll go down the line. I think you guys should go first on this one.
Is to get the U.S. taxpayer on the spigot subsidizing the regime. They succeeded in that in the 1990s with the Europeans by portraying the European investment in the Cuban economy, economic reform, as a way to transform Cuba. What it did was not transform Cuba, but transform those investors into lobbyists for the Cuban regime, and they would like to have the same opportunity with the United States. Paradoxically, the Europeans, the Mexicans, the Canadians are owed billions of dollars by Havana. Last year, 2025, under the Trump administration, the Cuban government purchased cash and carry over $800 million in U.S. products. And the promise is to the Chamber of Commerce and others that this is just the beginning, that if you open up, the sky's the limit. The reality is if you open up, you're going to be at the end of the line of folks looking to get repaid because you're not going to see the money if it's not up front. So.
Thank you.
Dr. Gutierrez?
Jeff, I want to apologize. I have to depart for a meeting.
And I also
That's okay.
in Spanish,
I know we're short on time,
yeah,
but
we can continue the conversation also.
sure. You're excused. You can go. We'll finish up just a couple of minutes, but I want to finish answering Lisa's question and maybe one more. David, do you have any comment on this?
Well, I think it's only to express agreement. They're obviously playing on those persons who would be tempted. I mean, this is all communist regimes do this. The Soviet Union did the same thing, by the way, and they use various means to attract, because their mentality is so warped that when they begin to speak like normal people, when they begin to, when Putin wears a cross, when businessmen talk about business opportunities, when they speak about their desire for peace, we of course take this all literally, because we have trouble penetrating their deranged minds. And it's only when you realize who it is who is saying these things that you understand that it cannot be taken seriously.
I think one of the greatest lines in your documentary, David, The Age of Delirium, I think it was something to the effect of living in the Soviet Union can sometimes be like a dream, but occasionally the KGB takes you back to reality. To answer the other part of your question about young people, I think you raise a very important point, because young people are obviously a huge target audience here. They are the future. And I worry about younger people, especially when it comes to this, and understanding the importance of history. As Dr. Gutierrez has said earlier, we have a lot of people, especially in various Latino communities, especially in the Cuban community here in Miami, that fought very heroically against the Castro regime. And I want to make sure that those younger people know the truth about what happened with the Brigade 2506. We have Jose Daniel Ferrer here today, one of the most important opposition leaders in Cuba's recent history. And I want to make sure that those young people know what he has done, what Paco has done, the legacy that they leave behind. And we're going to need to make sure that we're combating disinformation, so the truth about the people who have the courage to stand up for what's important get their message across instead of the regimes that they're combating. Thank you very much.
U.S. university system has been to set up exchange programs in Havana. And the FBI has identified that that is one of their chief ways to recruit. They not only do it with the trips to Cuba, they also do it here in the U.S. Ana Belén Montes was recruited as a graduate student.
It's true.
Manuel Rocha, who infiltrated the NSC, was an ambassador to Bolivia, was recruited as a student. So you are a target of the Cuban intelligence service, and they look to invest in young people to have them infiltrate and rise up to influence in important positions in the U.S. government and other aspects of U.S. society. So that's not to be underestimated.
Very important point.
Very.
We'll talk to all of you outside.